Okay, yeah. Okay, so we'll start. We are in the book Beaker Chicago, and we are on page 13, the bottom of page 13. So it's class 4 of Beaker Chicago, or on page 13, the bottom of page 13. So what have we been talking about? Right, this is a collection of teachings from the previous Rebbe in his visit to Chicago. And we're in the middle of one of his talks that he was talking about the story of Reb Baruch Mordechai, who as a boy grew up in a small town, and then as he got older and he left home and he went to different places, he was very, very, very learned, and he became connected to Hasidim and to the teachings of Hasidus. And his father passed away. His mother married one of the Misnagdish leaders, who he wound up marrying that person's daughter. And it's talking about his process in becoming a chassid. The part that we're in the middle of is actually his own, Reb Baruch Mordechai's own accounting of how he became a chassid, or how he became connected to the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. On the bottom of page 12, it started talking about how his father and Rabbi Avram shared recollections from his great uncle Menachem about Baruch Mordechai himself, talking about it when he was in Lubavitch as an elderly man in his 90s, his own experiences. So we just began that section, and in that section he talked about his first yichidus, his first personal meeting with the Alter Rebbe, and about how in order to meet with the Alter Rebbe when he first came, they learned the first he came to Liège, and then they had a certain amount of studying that they were supposed to do, and after a few weeks of that studying and being tested, he was admitted into the Yechidus, into the first personal meeting with the Rebbe, and now like last week we left off that he was about to go in for that personal meeting with the Alter Rebbe, and how he was already in a daze from all of the scholarly debates and learning that he had been assigned to do, and the testing he had been assigned to do, and he prepared for 2 weeks, and now he's going in to the Rebbe. So now it's still his recollections, still the speaker, still Reb Baruch Mordechai talking about his recollections, and now he's going to be describing that what happened at that first yichidus. So on the bottom of page 13, so it says, at that yichidus, at that private audience, the Rebbe did not answer my questions on matter of avodah. Avodah again is that spiritual work, inner work in the service of Hashem. So he did not answer those questions. Instead, he asked me if I had any queries arising from my studies and on which subjects. For over a year, there were 2 thorny passages, one in the Yerushalmi. There's 2 Talmuds, Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud that was authored by the scholars in Bavel, and the Talmud that was authored by the scholars in Eretz Yisrael. The one that is usually studied when we say people are studying Talmud is the Talmud Bavli, but people also study the Talmud Yerushalmi. So that's why it's called the Yerushalmi. So we had a question on a section of learning in the Yerushalmi Talmud and one in the Rambam. The Rambam is a codifier of Jewish law, and he said, for which I hadn't found no solution. So he had 2 questions in the revealed aspects of Torah. Both Yerushalmi and Rambam were the revealed aspects of Torah. Remember, he had said earlier that what drew him to the Alter Rebbe was not his learning in the revealed aspects of Torah, but rather in Hasidus. And yet, we're going to see that what happens now when he poses these questions. So who knows why the Alter Rebbe chose to ask him this question, but perhaps because he intuited that this was not something that he was connecting to him in this way, and maybe he wanted to have that resolved. But the Alter Rebbe asked him, what are your questions? And these were the two questions that he'd been carrying around with him in his learning. When I had presented them, when Rebbe Rayatz had presented these two questions to the Gaon of Vilna, he explained them to me clearly, but he did not unravel their riddles. Meaning, he explained the concepts that were going on there, but he still had the questions left. When I now stood before the Rebbe Yechidus, I posed both questions and was amazed to hear his structured solutions. We asked these questions, and he got his answers. And it was like, you're going to see, this is going to have a very long-ranging effect. Leaving the upstairs Yechidus room, I went downstairs to the lower Garden of Eden. So this is an appellation that Hasidim call the Yechidus room of their Rebbe, the higher Gan Eden, and they call the room that you go out into after the Yechidus the lower Gan Eden. Gan Eden Ha'alim, Gan Eden Ha'tachtim. That's the terminology. So that's what Hasidim used to call the small shul in the Rebbe's home, that you went out to after Yechidus. Arriving there, I was taken in to join those present in the traditional Yechidus dance, also known as the Yechidus Karahad, which customarily followed Yechidus throughout the first 3 generations of Chabad Rebbes. So that was a minhag that people did when they came out of Yechidus. The Hasidim in the shul would bring them into a dance, and they would sing and dance like a celebration that this Chassid had just had a Yechidus, and so now we have some direction and some inspiration and something, to further his service in his life. So it was a very joyous occasion, and people were always swept up into this dance, the first 3 generations of Rebbeim. However, I saw nothing and heard nothing. I was still awestruck by the superhuman brilliance of the Rebbe's solutions to my 2 problems. So he couldn't even, he danced with them, but like he was like in another world because of the fact that the Rebbe had answered these questions that he'd been carrying around for years. He just answered them clearly, and he was like amazed. Throughout the 3 years between my first visit to the Yajna and the second one, the image of the Rebbe stood constantly before my eyes, and his holy voice, with its teachings in Nigla and Chassidus, rang in my ears. And back at home, I tackled my study of my maamarim and Chassidus even more earnestly than before, and my study of Nigla, too, became more intensive and more profound. Remember, the maamarim are the hidden aspects of Torah, Chassidus, and the Nigla is the revealed aspects. It's just saying my internet is not stable. So if we get disconnected, I'll try to, of course, come right on. I'm just going to get my phone ready to make it a hotspot if I need to do that. Okay. I just had spent those few weeks in the company of 3 veritable princes while he was there. I had observed how reverently Reb Mordechai related to every word written by Rashi. The Rashi members, the main commentary on the Chumash, on the 5 books of the Torah, and how earnestly he weighed every query and answer proposed by Tosfos. That's the main commentary in the Gemara. So he noticed how this Reb Mordechai studied the commentary on Chumash and the commentary on the Gemara with like such reverence. I had heard the subtle logic of arguments with which Rav Moshe analyzed the statements of Rambam or resolved seeming contradictions between parallel passages in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. So he heard Rav Moshe was also a chassid, analyze these halachic statements. Again, these are the revealed aspects of Torah. So sometimes in the Gemara, if they are discussing the same topic in the Yerushalmi Gemara and the Bavli Gemara, so it could be that they're talking different, they say different things. So you have to figure out how do you make peace between them. I had seen how Reb Leib, seeking to deduce valid halachic conclusions, shuddered with an awe of heaven as he took note of a gloss written by the Ramah or a fine point made by the Taz or the Shach. These are all commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. So these teachings are all teachings in the revealed aspects of Torah. Remember, that was not something he was so connected to Chasidim, to the Alter Rebbe, in the revealed teachings of Torah until now, when he sees the Alter Rebbe answered his questions, which were in the revealed aspects of Torah, and he sees the Chasidim studying with such awe of heaven the revealed aspects of Torah. It completely sort of transformed the way that he is seeing it and experiencing it. Those experiences, and above all, the Rebbe had opened up a fresh conduit of progress in my comprehension and mastery of the Torah, and it was with a truly broken heart that I took my leave of them all. In other words, this is a terminology that we see, the idea of being a conduit, right? That we want to have an open pipeline between Hashem and us, that to be able to understand Torah more clearly, to be able to connect to Hashem. So through other people showing the way, and they themselves having this connection, can help all of us who are in connection with them and in contact with them to also feel like our pipes are open. We get on our pipes that might be clogged with sediment or something like that, can get cleaned out by being in contact and seeing how these people relate to their Torah learning, relate to Hashem. And he was so inspired that he felt that he was affected by the fact of seeing all these people connected to God in this way in their studying of Jewish law, of Talmud, right? It wasn't even the teachings of Hasidus. It wasn't these Hasidic discourses that talk about the upper realms and Hashem and our relation, right? It was like law and things that were very in the revealed aspects of Torah. But the way they approached it was with that love of Hasidus, of Hashem, and the relationship, that it inspired him and helped him feel also more ignited. So now he's going to talk about that's his yichidus and its effect. And now he's going to talk about as he goes home, like what happens as he goes home. So we had set out from there. Does anybody have any questions before we go on to the next part of his story? This is still Rebbe Baruch Mordechai talking. He for the next couple of pages, but
just a little question.
Sure.
Why did they stop doing the dance?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have the answer to it.
Okay. It just struck me.
Well, the first three. That was the first three. Yeah. The Rebbe Marash was still in Lubavitch, so it's not even like you say, oh, Rebbe Rashab moved to Rostov. Maybe there was something going on over there. I don't know.
Okay, just something.
Maybe I can find out. Yeah. Okay, we had set out, so bottom of page 14, we had set out from there as a band of about 60, meaning leaving Liazna, including many married men who were serious scholars, as well as elder Hasidim who had been groomed by Rebbe Menachem of Harduk and Rebbe Avram of Kalitsk, and had even visited the Maggid of Mezrich. So remember, Rebbe Menachem of Harduk was a student, well, these were both students of the Maggid, and Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Harduk, the Alter Rebbe viewed as a mentor of his. And he's saying some of these Hasidim also had even visited the Maggid in his lifetime, who was the teacher of the Alter Rebbe and the student of the Baal Shem Tov, right? That's how the line of Hasidus went. Torah teachings were repeated, stories and traditions were exchanged, and in every village and township that we passed through, we were received happily and lovingly. Yet despite all of that, every one of us was sore at heart because we had taken our leave of that fountain of the revealed and hidden waters of the Torah. The beautiful way of describing it, right? Very, very poetic. Our party lessened as we continued, until by the time we reached Shvetzien, we were a little group of just 5, 3 who lived there and 2 who lived in Vilna. A few miles before Shvetzien, we 2 Vilnaites had to part from our 3 friends. By that time, the Brotherhood of Hasidim in Shvetzien was no longer undercover, and although these 3 were not full-time scholars, but businessmen, they were widely known to be Hasidim. So in order that we should not be suspected of being connected with them, we had to part ways. Remember, we spoke last week about the idea that at this point in time, there still needed to be some secrecy involved because people were very against the Hasidim, which they called the sect, the Kat. Arriving home, I yearned for the Rebbe and for those 3 scholars, the ones he had mentioned earlier, how he saw them learning, and for the entire holy brotherhood that surrounded the Rebbe. I quenched that thirst by throwing myself into the study of Nigla and of the maamarim of Hasidus that I had brought with me. In fact, I became so deeply immersed in my studies after a short time, I often neglected to deliver the shiurim, the classes, which I was meant to give at the yeshiva, and for which I was being paid generously and respectfully. In other words, he was teaching at the yeshiva. They didn't suspect that he was a chassid. He was teaching at that yeshiva. Remember, his father-in-law, he married, and there was this family who had funded this yeshiva and so on. So he was teaching there, but he was so engrossed in reviewing what he learned and learning more of the Hasidus and the Nigla and the manner that he saw that he he would forget to go and give his classes. He would just become so immersed with his own learning, he would just forget to go give his classes. My brother-in-law, right, as one of the sons of this Rosh Yeshiva, my brother-in-law, Victor, who's going to figure again later, so keep that name in mind, his brother-in-law, Rebbe Victor, who lectured in a lower class at the same yeshiva, rebuked me sternly. He argued that I was depriving the public of their Torah study and that my attitude to my God-given profession was dishonest. It was quite harsh with him. For some time, nevertheless, the only way I could find peace of mind and satisfaction was through intensive study of the text that I had brought with me. So he couldn't help himself. So for a while, that's just what happened, and I guess he got reprimanded. That's how overcome he was with the experience that he had had in the Yajna by the Rebbe. Okay, the next thing is he goes on to a story, and it's like, oh, such a shame, this story, but I mean, it was an amazing story, but it's like a shame that it didn't have a different ending. But a different brother-in-law now, he's going to have to tell another story. My brother-in-law, Reb Shlomo, a different brother-in-law, had known of my two above-mentioned problematic questions and also of the answers given by the Gaon of Vilna. Right? Remember those two questions that the Alter Rebbe asked him, do you have any questions? And he had questions, and then the Alter Rebbe answered them. So his brother-in-law and he both had those questions. So he knew of the questions, and he also knew the answer that the Gaon of Vilna had given him, which explained the concept but didn't do away with the questions, right? Because we often used to discuss them in the hope that we could possibly hit upon their solutions. So now, when I had real answers, I thought it would only be proper to tell him, right? He came back, he has the answers, he's going to share it with him. Unfortunately, this could not be done because when I returned, I discovered he was not at home. He had undertaken a trek of self-imposed exile. So this idea of a self-imposed exile, if anybody does decide to read more of memoirs and so on, was something that people did at that time. It has a little footnote here, actually. It says, a lengthy penitential exercise whereby a man would undergo privation as he wandered incognito, as if homeless, from township to township. So people would do this as like a form of tshuva, basically. That they would, what's called pravangolas, they would put themselves into a self-imposed exile, sometimes for a month or a year or something like that, where they would leave home with just the clothing on their back, and maybe one day's food, I don't know, even if, that, and then they had different rules for themselves, like they would only accept something that was given to everybody. They wouldn't accept sukkah. They would not sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row. They wouldn't tell anybody who they were, even if they were a known scholar, so that they would be treated less respectfully. In other words, it was a form of it was supposed to be a form of tshuva, of sort of self deprivation to to cleanse the person, something like that. So the people did that at that time. Some of the scholars did that at that time. So he wasn't there when he got back. His brother-in-law, Reb Shlomo, wasn't there when Reb Baruch Mordechai got back. When he returned home a few months later, he was elated to hear the answers and insisted that we should visit the Gaon to hear his appraisal of them. As soon as I mentioned one of those problematic passages, the Gaon outlined them both, cited his earlier intended answers, and added that since my previous visit, he had thought about the problem several times, but that he had not found satisfactory solutions. Seated in his place and wearing his talis and tefillin, he was now so exhilarated by the answers I quoted that he stood up and said these very words: "Such solutions can be given only by the head of the academy on high." So if you look at the footnote, it says this term, Rosh Yeshiva Derakia, in the Zohar refers to the elevated soul that presides over the academy of the souls in heaven. There is what's called the yeshiva in heaven, where the souls sit and learn, and there's like down here, there's a Rosh Yeshiva ahead of the yeshiva. Up in heaven, there's also a Rosh Yeshiva. There's a soul that's in charge of the learning there, so to speak. So the Gaon of Vilna said, such solutions can be only given by the head of the Academy of High, meaning a very lofty soul. If a Gaon, a tzaddik, said this, he knows it by divine inspiration. Meaning, it's being taught in heaven. That's how he found out. It's the Rosh Yeshiva in heaven is teaching this to the souls, and that's how this tzaddik who's alive found this out. He was able to intuit what's being taught in heaven. That's the only way he could possibly know this answer. If I heard it from the mouth of that Gaon and Tzaddik in person, then in the words of Rabbi Yochanan, I would carry his clothes to the bathhouse like a humble servant. That's what the Gaon of Vilna said of the answer given by the Alter Rebbe to these two problematic issues. In response, my brother-in-law, Reb Shlomo, spoke up. Reb Baruch Mordechai isn't giving the name of the Gaon and Tzaddik who solved those problems. Hearing this, the Gaon gave me a strong look and said nothing. It was one of those things that you wonder what would have happened if he had said the name. But later, Reb Baruch Mordechai is saying, I earnestly regretted that I had not told the Gaon that it was the Rebbe, the leader of the Hasidim, as he was then called, who had answered my two queries. That could possibly have brought about a spirit of closeness that would have averted such mistakes as were made by the leading learned opponents of Hasidus. Like he had regret in his later years, because they were saying all sorts of horrible things about Rebbe, and there was a lot more contention between the Misnagdim and the Hasidim, really sort of headed by the Vilna Gaon, and he felt afterwards that he had had the opportunity to tell him this, and possibly, years and years of issues might have been averted. But I guess, who knows, he doesn't explain why he didn't, but one could assume that he was scared to tell him who it was at that time. When the Gaon decreed that the Tanya should be burned, the book that the Alter Rebbe wrote, even though by that time my identity as part of the Hasidic Brotherhood was well known, he had a certain degree of tolerance for me. Meaning, the Gaon said it should be burned. That meant that he felt it was, like, God forbid, heretical, right? That he didn't want it. And he still had a relationship with Baruch Mordechai because of their previous relationship. So at that point, I told him that I had heard these two answers from the Rebbe. And he reminded him of how he cited Rabbi Yochanan, that he would have carried this scholar's clothing to the bathhouse. However, he did not accept what I said, meaning he didn't sort of fully believe him, arguing that according to the laws of Torah was not a trustworthy source since I was an interested party. Meaning, because already he was known to be a chassid at the time that he said it, he said he's not an impartial witness anymore. He can't be trusted with that, so to speak, testimony. So he tried to make it right later on, but it wasn't accepted. So again, it's sort of like, okay, hashgacha pratis, how whatever Hashem wanted, but it feels like such a missed opportunity. So he's saying that, he also regretted it. Anyway, that's the end of Reb Baruch Mordechai's description of his connection and, how he became a chassid, and then how he became close to the Alter Rebbe. So now it's going to go on. It's going to still continue. We're still going to have stories of him, but now it's not going to be his recollections anymore, right? The Friedrich started by talking about him, and then quoted him in the middle, and now it's going to be the previous Rebbe again talking more about him. So I don't know if there's any questions before we go back to the words of the previous Rebbe. We're on the bottom of page 16. It's a very rich, very, very rich, right? Like the details, you can really imagine being there almost. Okay, so let's continue. So now these are the words of the previous Rebbe. According to what we know of the history of Hasidim in general, and of Vilna in particular, in the 6 years from 1796 to 1802, and of the protagonists on both sides, Rebbe Baruch Mordechai was one of the pillars on whom the Hasidic community was able to rely. He was also respected by the Misnagdim. Remember, he was a great scholar. He was called the logician, right? I mean, they knew he didn't not become a great scholar anymore because he became a chassid. They still had to admit his greatness, meaning, and he was married to the previous Rav's daughter, and there was a certain measure of understanding that how he was respected, but still there's other issues, but he was still respected. In fact, at the end of 5561 or the beginning of 5562, late 1801, the communal leaders of Bais decided to appoint him as the city's Rav, and within a very short time, he had earned an outstanding reputation in rabbinic circles, which included the leading scholars of Sklov, Sklatsk, and Minsk. That's sort of how he started. He was introduced to us as the Rav of Bais, and then we went back to talk about in his earlier years how he became connected to the Hasidim. But And these three cities had great respect for him, even though they were very Misnagdish cities. They were mentioned also in the beginning. And when he left Vilna, a few dozen Hasidic families followed him and settled in Bobroisk because they wanted to be near him. One of the Vilna Hasidim was Reb Chaim Zelig, a Torah scholar who was also involved in Hasidus, as was then common. He supported himself by hiring out wagon drivers and carriages for merchants who traveled among the surrounding towns. One of those drivers, an unlettered young man called Reb Zalman Leib, had lost his learned father at an early age, so he didn't have his father to teach him, and had rolled about without guidance until a Hasidic school teacher called Rabbi Yaakov Shlomo employed him to escort the young pupils to and from his cheder. So in other words, he took him under his wing a little bit and gave him a job, basically, in a safe environment. He was a simple fellow, but God-fearing and pure of heart. With great effort, he gained some basic knowledge, but since he was unable to understand text written in the Holy Tongue, he learned whatever he could from Yiddish translations. The Jewish people mainly spoke Yiddish at that time to each other, so that was their conversational tongue. So anything that was written in Yiddish, he had an easier time to understand. So he wasn't very learned, but he was a good God-fearing person. He once heard that one of the poskim writes that one ought to read each verse of the weekly Torah reading twice in the Holy Tongue and once in Aramaic Targum. Remember, we spoke about that, I think, in the first class. So he found out about this custom. He also heard that a God-fearing person who seeks to perform his mitzvahs in the best possible manner should also study the commentary of Rashi. And if he does not understand the Holy Tongue, he should instead learn Tzana Urena. So Rashi is a commentator on the verse in the Chumash. We talked about that, I think, as well, that where we were asked to learn the Torah portion of the week with the commentary of Rashi. We mentioned Chabad.org. You can do it in English and everything. It's very accessible today. But again, if a person didn't understand Hebrew in those days, he understood Yiddish, he could instead learn Tzana Urena, which was a compilation of midrashim that was written in Yiddish. And women and girls usually learned that for the weekly Torah portion because it was a midrash on the weekly Torah portion. And so if he didn't understand Hebrew, so he learned that instead. From that time on, Zalman Leib would review the weekly parsha twice in the Holy Tongue and once in Aramaic, but would also learn the Yiddish commentary of Tzana Urena, so that it's like commentary on the Torah portion of that week, so he would understand it. After his marriage, he began to work for Chaim Zelig as a wagon driver. Instead of bringing the kids up and back to cheder, he started to work as a wagon driver, and was therefore known by the local townsmen as Zalman Leib the Whipster. For several years, he grew to be part of the extended family of the Vilna's Hasidim, davening with the same nusach and living a Hasidic lifestyle, despite the fact that he had to spend day and nights on the road to eke out his livelihood. Regardless of his ignorance, his davening was an outpouring of the soul. Tears came to him readily, and his heart was sore, especially because he had learned so little, and with all his soul he yearned to get to know the Torah. Whoever heard him davening was moved by his sweet voice, but the local Misnagdim continued to refer to him as Reb Zalman Leib the Whipster. In due course, he and his family joined the families that moved from Vilna to Bobroisk with Reb Baruch Mordechai, where Reb Baruch Mordechai advised him to leave his work as a wagon driver and grow vegetables. This he did, and his labors were generously blessed from above. He was so happy with his change of fortune that despite his age, he hired himself a malamed teacher to teach him at a certain time every day, and whenever his work allowed him a free day, he davened at length. So he used his newfound fortune to learn Torah and to daven. And so he wasn't especially learned, but he was a very special, holy Jew. So now Baruch Mordechai had moved from Vilna to Bobroisk, and a bunch of families came with him, and amongst those families was this Zalman Leib. So now there's going to be a story in Bobroisk with Zalman Leib. That's why we got a whole introduction to him and who he is, because there's going to be a story with him now. It so happened that after some time, the Rosh Yeshiva, after some time, Rabbi Vigdor, the Rosh Yeshiva, was in Minsk. Remember, Rabbi Vigdor was the brother-in-law of Baruch Mordechai. So after some time, he was in Minsk. Now, ever since word got out that Reb Baruch Mordechai belonged to the Hasidic sect, his brothers-in-law had broken off all contact with him. right? That was not uncommon, unfortunately, that people, if they would find out that their family members became Hasidim, they would sort of ostracize them. So his two brothers-in-law, who remembered, they were the reason, like they were the one who recommended that he marry their sister, but now, they're not talking to him anymore because he became a Chassid. So, nevertheless, when Reb Avigdor now learned while in Minsk that the leading local scholars held him in high esteem, he notified Reb Baruch Mordechai that he would like to visit him in Bais. Remember, we see all these little pieces that the previous Rebbe is telling us all come together now in this story, right? The fact that he left Vilna, he became an open chassid, but he was still respected in these bastions of Masnagdishkeit. So when his brother-in-law, who was no longer sort of in contact with him, went to one of those cities where they talked highly of his brother-in-law, even though he became a chassid, he decided it was time for him to go pay him a visit and to see him. He was in the area. Reb Baruch Mordechai, being by nature placid and peace-loving, Reb Baruch Mordechai immediately convened a meeting of the 7 lay leaders of the community, together with the most prominent scholars and other respected townsmen. It was decided that they should dispatch a delegation of Torah scholars to greet him at one of the townships on the way. They also decided to set up an impressive reception in one of the largest shuls in town, where the distinguished guest would deliver a learned discourse. This was a common way that they would honor Torah scholars, is that when they would come to the city, they would be asked to speak in the shul. It was like a sign of respect that they had something to teach, so they would do that. So his brother-in-law asks him to meet with him, and he says yes, and he sets this whole, very prestigious, warm welcome, and he sets it up so that he comes to the shul so that he can deliver a Torah thought. The guest of honor was duly conducted to the packed shul, but in order to allow him to rest a little from his arduous journey, he was first shown to a side room. And since this was a Hasidic shul, a door from that side room opened into a little Chabad, a cozy nook for those who meditated at length while davening. This is a custom from, I don't know which Rebbe started, that there's in a Chabad shul, there always needs to be a side room that people can go off to if they want to daven at length. They can sit and daven at length if they're not davening as quickly as the minyan is, and it's called the Chabad. So this was the big shul, and this Rebbe Avigdor was shown to a side room, but that side room was connected to this Chabad, which could have a person davening, all day long. Let's say a person who didn't finish davening Shachos in the morning, he's just continuing to daven all day long, and he's still davening, singing and crying and davening and so on. He doesn't want to end. He just sits and davens all day. So he's resting, or he's in that side room, and from that door, the sweet voice of a soul pouring itself out to its maker reached his ears. It captured his heart and left him wondering. He was very moved by the sound of this person's prayers. He then reminded himself that Bobroisk was a town with many Hasidim, some of whom davened at length, even long after midday. So this must be the voice of one of those people, right? It's not something that the Masnagdim necessarily did, but he remembered the Hasidim do, so it must be one of those people. Nevertheless, he was so moved by these soulful tones that he asked his brother-in-law, who is this chassid, this late davener? He couldn't help himself. He was inspired by him. He couldn't help himself. So he's asking the question. Okay. That's Zalman Leib, the whipster, Baruch Mordechai replied. He used to be one of Chaim Zell's wagon drivers in Vilna. Rebbe Avigdor reacted scornfully. Zalman Leib, the whipster, that's what you call a davener? Him, he's barely the heel of a davener. Right? This was a, unfortunately, not uncommon response of Masnagdim about unlearned people. They sort of were a little scornful about somebody who wasn't learned. So even though he had a moment before been so moved by his davening, but when he heard who it was, he was like, oh, that person, that's nobody to be impressed by. And he called him the heel of a davener. But Baruch Mordechai remained silent. Soon after, Rebbe Avigdor delivered his erudite pilpul, that's like his Torah concept, and then, for the benefit of the less learned householder, added a teaching in the realm of Agada. That's like medrash. So he did a whole, complex Torah up and back pilpul. Pilpul is like, unraveling, unpacking, analyzing a concept in Torah. So it would be harder for people who weren't learning to follow. So he did that first, and then he did something in Agada, which is like the medrash stories, those kinds of things, which would be easier for somebody to understand, even if they're not very learned. So he did both. As he stepped down from the dais, he was more than a little pleased with himself. At that moment, catching the sight of Reb Zalman Leib, who had been in his audience, he couldn't refrain from remarking, "Ah, there goes that heel davener." A little ouchy, right? Like, not so nice. In response to that intended public insult to the individual and to the Hasidus and Hasidim at large, Reb Baruch Mordechai replied, "The heel of a davener is highly esteemed in the Torah, and is of benefit in 3 areas." That was Reb Baruch Mordechai's response. By this time, the scholars and leading townsmen of Bais was familiar with the clear mind and the restraints of their Rav, so they now expected to hear a pungent witticism. After all, that was his style, to bring a person to face his true worth by means of a gentle jibe. Whereas they were waiting to hear, how is this a response to that nasty comment? Instead, Rebbe Baruch Mordechai said, it is stated explicitly in a Mishnah that the heel of a davener teaches 3 things. It's like, does anybody know? Rebbe Victor looked at him in puzzlement. So did the local scholars, waiting for him to quote this unfamiliar source. After a few minutes, during which none of those present proposed a source, Rebbe Baruch Mordechai told them that the following Mishnah appears in Pirkei Avos. Okay, so just to sidetrack a little bit before we learn this, we've talked before in other classes about this idea that Hasidus sometimes takes a verse, or in this case a Mishnah, or a quote from the Talmud, and translates the words sort of on a deeper level to learn a Kabbalistic lesson from it. So that's what's going to happen here. There's a literal way to translate this Mishnah, which means sort of one thing, and now he's going to take the liberty of retranslating it, and that's going to teach a deeper lesson. Okay? So this is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Now, Pirkei Avos is a Mishnah. It's Mishnahs that we study Chassidim study between Pesach and Rosh Hashanah, when on Shabbos, when the Shabbos afternoons are longer, the rest of the world studies between Pesach and Shavuos. And it basically teaches good character traits. It teaches what's called Lifnim Mishoras Hadin. It's not halacha. Most Mishnah is halacha. Pirkei Avos is not halacha. It's like teachings. It's called ethics of the fathers. So in English, so like it's the idea that it's teaching ethical behaviors. So he took one of these Mishnayos and he's going to retranslate it to get a deeper meaning out of it. So the Mishnah reads, Akavia ben Mahalalel says. Now, in the literal translation, Akavia ben Mahalal is the name of a person. Akavia, the son of Mahalal. That's the name of the person says, and then he says 3 things. Most of Pirkei Avos is quoting the person and saying his teaching, quoting the next person saying his teaching. So this is the name of the person, but he's going to retranslate this term, Akavia ben Mahalalel, because the names have, each of those words has a meaning. So Akavia, from the word Akev, means a heel, and Mahalalel, from the word like Hallel, means praise. So what's praise? Like somebody who's praising Hashem. That's another way of saying somebody who's davening, right? Because we daven, we praise Hashem. So now he's retranslating Akavia ben Mahalal says that is the heel of a davener who praises God tells you. Meaning, what does the heel of somebody who is davening teach us? Right? Because he calls him the heel of a davener. So now he's going to show him, well, that's actually a very high level. The heel of a davener teaches us 3 things, because the Pirkei Avos is going to tell us these 3 things that the heel of a davener tells us. So the heel of a davener says, reflect intently upon 3 things and you will not come to sin, meaning you will not transgress the commands of Hashem. So the heel of the davener is going to teach us these 3 things. And these are the three things. Know from where you came and to where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give an accounting. That's the three things that this sage, Akavi ben Mahala, tells us. And now it's being retranslated at the heel of a davener teaches us these three things. And I was going to explain what does each of those three things mean. From where you came, from a putrid drop. That's what the Mishnah says. In other words, if a person is ever feeling too haughty, remind yourself. We should remind ourselves that we came from a putrid drop. Like how are we so unbelievable? Like we're So now Rebbe Rayatz is explaining what does that mean from a putrid drop. If you know that you came from nothing more than a malodorous, if I'm pronouncing that properly, drop, you won't be arrogant. I mean, if you remember your humble beginnings, you won't be arrogant. And to where you are going, to a place of dust, maggots, and worms after burial, right? That's what happens. So again, he's explaining, if you know that the place where you're going is the worm-infested earth, you'll be free of lust and a desire for money, because it doesn't help anybody underground. Those things they can't, as they say, you can't take it with you when you go, right? It's not anything you can take with you when you go. And the third thing is, so for the first thing will teach us to be not arrogant. And the second thing will teach us not to get too overly involved in the physical world, right? In the pursuit of money and lusting after things. And the third thing is, and before whom you're destined to give an accounting, before the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. If a person realizes that he will be accountable to the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, he will stand in fear of sin. Meaning, doesn't mean fear like terror. It means awe of Hashem. He's going to get himself to stop from sinning. Meaning what Rebbe Rayatz is saying is that the heel of a davener teaches us to remind us where we came from, so that we stay humble, and where we're going, so that we don't get too over involved in the physical and the materialistic aspects of the world, and who we have to give an accounting to after our passing. So if we're going to have, if we know that we have to stand in front of Hashem and explain ourselves at the end of our life, we might choose differently, so that we have a little less explaining to do when we get there. We might choose to engage in things that we're going to be happy to say to Hashem, this is what we did, as opposed to try to figure out excuses for ourselves about why we did them. So but now the Rebbe Rayatz is telling us the heel of a davener teaches us that, right? Like watching a person daven, basically is davening properly, could teach us that. Okay, so all of a sudden, this person who was just insulted, right, has now become the source of this incredible teaching. So he's lifted him up from being put down to this, look what we're learning from him. The fact that he's davening so beautifully, his heel, meaning just his doing this davening in this fashion, is reminding us where we came from, where we're going, and who we need to put an accounting for. And that inspiration of watching him davening and the open heart it causes in us is priceless. That's that was his response to his brother-in-law's calling him that he's a heel davener. Although Rebbe Rayatz's creative reading of the Mishnah is no more than a Hasidic interpretation, it reflects the conceptual basis and thought process of a Chassid. See, now this is the previous Rebbe explaining this teaching of Rebbe Rayatz, that it's being not only he saved embarrassment to the Jew and he creatively explained this Mishnah, but it's axiomatic of the way that Hasidim approach Torah learning, basically. Indeed, although Chabad Hasidus deals with profound philosophical expositions, right? Like we did a few maamarim already in this class. We see that there's sometimes very, very complicated philosophical Kabbalistic ideas that are being unpacked, and even later on in Bikur Chicago, there will be some maamarim that will also become very profound in the mechanical teachings, with different Kabbalistic terminology and so on. So even though that is true, it diffuses its lights by means of very common expressions and interpretations that are readily comprehensible. Meaning Hasidus also deals with like the simple explanations, and they give them a little twist, a little twist for like a little bit of a deeper insight, something that we can, take with us, a nugget that we can take with us in our walk through that day. What can I remember? What can I think about if I'm, whatever it is that I have to overcome, whether it's a temptation or whether it's despondency or whatever it is, anger, whatever it is, what can I, bring into myself to be able to move forward in a more gracious way in this world, gracious to my godly soul, right? Even when they may appear to be mere witticisms, they convey the entire weight of teachings of Chabad Hasidus. They highlight the loftiest and sweetest modes of Hasidic conduct, both in the upright relationships between man and God and between man and man. So this little teaching, so to speak, is very profound. If somebody really literally thinks about these three things every day, their whole day will be different. And the fact that it was learned through the actions of a person who is not learned in Torah, but is, so to speak, practiced in the service of Hashem, also elevates the servers of Hashem, even if they're not learned, to a different status, right? So there's like two things happening at once. There's a relationship between us and Hashem, and there's a relationship between us and other Jews and the way we look at another Jew. Because now all of a sudden, it's not just the teaching that he taught, it's also the fact that he taught it through this simple Jew, which means, like the Baal Shem Tov teaches and all the Chabad Rebbeim teach, that we have a lot to learn from every single person who we come into contact with. It's not just that we can learn from learned people or from people who are more learned than we are. We can learn from people who are less learned than we are, right? Everybody's someplace in the continuum. There's always people who know more than we do, and there's always people who know less than we do. Like that, it's a continuous process. So it's not that we're only learning from people who know more than we do. We're also learning from people who know less than we do, because maybe they have another area where they're more developed in their service of Hashem than we are, and we can learn from that. So the fact that he taught us through this person who was considered to be not learned meant that he was not just teaching us information, he was also teaching us a way of approaching our service of Hashem and a way of thinking about another Jew. Does that make sense? The Torah is light. It lights up a person's entire spiritual stature, from its highest faculty, which is the capacity for pleasure, down to its lowest faculty, which is the capacity for action. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the highest level of the soul is the level of tainug, which is called, he's translating as pleasure or delight. That's the level of the soul that's connected to Hashem. And then there's, 5 levels of the soul, and then there's the 3 garments of the soul, and eventually sort of everything trickles down into the lowest level, which is action, right? There's the 5 levels of the soul, there's the intellect, there's the emotions, there's the 3 garments, thought, speech, and action is like the lowest. It's how the soul affects the world physically. It's the lowest of the levels. So all the way from up high, all the way to down low, the Torah, teaching Torah, lights up every aspect of the person. Every aspect of the person. It lights up the person's faculty of pleasure and will by showing him what he should want and from what he should derive pleasure. Meaning Torah teaches a person that his desires and where he looks for pleasure should be in the sublime levels of godliness and connecting to another Jew and so on. Like to teach him to not be as engrossed in just physical pleasures and desires, right? Like there's something else in the world besides eating and drinking and whatever, right? I mean, like it teaches that there's something beyond just the physical. It lights up so that's where it lights up the inner dimensions of his soul. It lights up his mind and the traits of his character, his Menachem and his midas, right? The intellect and the emotions, those 10 soul powers, teaching him where he should invest his brain, heart, and sensitivity, right? Instead of like using all his mental capacity for something that's, not godly or that important in the grand scheme of things. He should use his mental capacity for learning Torah and other things too, but like, you know, where he could focus and how he could focus, and his heart, what he should be drawn to, his sensitivity, what he should remain sensitive to. So the Torah is lighting up his supra rational powers of delight and his rational powers of his mind, his Menachem, and his emotions. The Torah also lights up the soul's three means of expression: thought, speech, and action. Those are called the garments of the soul, making them blossom to their utmost and embellishing them. So that's how those are the garments that the soul puts on in order to go out into the world, so to speak. We think, we talk, we act. Thus, it creates a superior intellectual construct which a person's thoughts can then recall. So it helps us think properly. It provides wisest and most beautiful phrases and the most refined expressions, showing a person what his speech should articulate in a manner. And it teaches him how to conduct himself in the realm of practical action, both between man and God and between man and his fellow man. In other words, this is how Torah brings light to everything. This is like such a beautiful summary and paragraph. It has so much in it. It's like you could like retype it and put it on your refrigerator to remind ourselves every day that learning Torah, this is what happens. It brings a light into the house. It brings a light into our souls, into the highest realms of the souls, all the way down into our actions. The teachings of Chabad Hasidus light up the entire spectrum of the Jewish people. So now this is like Torah in general. Torah is called light, but when you talk about Hasidus, it's even more revealed light. It lights up the entire spectrum of the Jewish people, from the highest levels, such as the heads of your tribes and your elders, to the humblest levels, the woodchoppers and the water drawers. These are terms in the Chumash that describe the entire Jewish people, reflecting like the leaders to the manual laborers who might not be very learned at all, right? The Hasidus, whereas some parts of Torah might be out of the reach of people who are not learned. They might not be able to understand them. It's too much. But Hasidus, everybody can connect at some level to Torah, and everybody can connect at some level to Hasidus and light them up. The teachings of Chabad Hasidus have been a wellspring of life-giving waters for scholars of worldwide repute and for brilliant intellectuals, such as Rabbi Yosef Kobel Shklov, that's another person, and the Gaon of our narrative, Rabbi Baruch Mordechai. Those teachings have also been a wellspring of life-giving waters for ordinary, unlettered fellows such as Reb Zalman Leib the Whipster, which is, you get the feeling that the whole reason why the Frierdiker Rebbe went into this whole discussion of Reb Zalman Leib and who he was, and then brought in the story of Reb Zalman Leib the Whipster, right? Like Reb Baruch Mordechai on one hand, and Reb Zalman Leib on the other hand, one a Gaon, an amazing mind, such a learned teacher, and one a simple Jew, and shows how they interrelate and how they both are affected by Chassidus. How Reb Zalman Leib Reb Baruch Mordechai is affected in the deep learning and analysis of both Nigla and Chassidus that Chassidus offers, and Reb Zalman Leib in the soulful davening and connection to Hashem, and they learn from each other, and they both bring something to the community. So you get the feeling that the whole purpose of this Sikha number 2, was to sort of help us see the preciousness of learning Torah in general and of learning Hasidus in specific through the eyes and the experience of these two people. In this universal relevance lies the secret of the life-giving power of the teachings of Hasidus, which show that the heel of a Hasidic davener expresses the 3 foremost points of a man's life. The teachings of Chabad Hasidus are accessible to all. They infuse all Jewish homes with the radiant light of Torah mitzvahs and with the sweet modes of conduct that express the love for one's fellow Jew. And they become even more accessible as they are translated into a lot of different languages, right? It talks about how Ein Yaakov was accessible because it was in Yiddish in those days, but now things are accessible in English and French and Russian, and right, like there's all things have been translated to the new Yiddish, so to speak, right? Like to the, the vernacular that Jews speak now, which is so many different languages because Jews live all over the world now. So the more things that are translated, the more accessible it is. But the point is, it's accessible because it speaks to the soul at a certain level. It's not only speaking to the intellect. So there's parts that speak to the intellect, but there's parts that speak to the soul. So there's a piece of connection for everyone. Are there any questions? I would almost
Yeah, I have
like,
a question.
yeah.
Okay. So I get that his interpretation of the heel reflects the general way that he learns, but was it his own novel interpretation, or was it a way that he was taught and then he just gave that over to everyone?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is how he's explaining it. It doesn't seem like he heard that somewhere else.
Okay. Oh, another question. So I see it's saying that it's accessible to everyone, but were they exclusive? Because if people really thought that they were doing the wrong thing by learning all these secrets of the Torah, but okay, so the same time that people were upset at them, were they very accepting, or were they exclusive in any way?
I'm not sure what you're asking. If you're asking,
oh, okay.
people, I'm sure we're wary that people shouldn't be informers and trying to like get them killed basically, but that doesn't mean that they weren't accepting. I mean, is that what
okay. So they were just wary, but they weren't actually anti anyone who wanted to learn their things.
Right.
Okay.
So I would almost like to recommend that after each class of this, in this section, I mean, I don't know if you want to do this, you don't want to do this, but almost to keep a journal, not just notes, but I feel like, especially these teachings of these, they can have like profound effects on us. Like there's a certain beauty, a certain poetry almost, and a certain beauty to all these things that if people want to, they can maybe capture in like 5 minutes after class, just to like write down some of their thoughts or feelings after learning it, because this is a little bit different than learning a maamarim or something like that. The way that the previous was speaking. Soon we're going to get to a maamarim, and we're going to get to another letter, another. It's going to be different things here, but anyway, that's pretty much it for today's lesson.
It was really good.
Have a good week. Yeah, it's pretty amazing stuff, huh? It's a
Really
little
good.
different. It's like